Hi, so as mentioned, Tim Webb. I had 10 years at Cisco, and I did kind of the big company game, growing up in fighting the good fight, and I had an opportunity for a moment there where I was actually working for a couple years from Mexico as a one guy to a remote team. So first off, my first experience virtual was the opposite of many in that I was trying to actually be a lead for a team where everyone was in a conference room and I had no idea what they were saying because they never remembered to put the mics in the right place. Fast forward 10 years later, 5 years ago, I jumped over to Genuitec, said I want to launch a product, and Genuitec was the complete opposite, all virtual. And what does that mean to be all virtual? Now, Genuitec, we're 35 employees. We have something like 29,000 desktop servers per employee. And if you figure that out, that requires massive efficiency. Yes, tools can be great, tools can be evil. Whatever you're doing when it comes to working virtually, you really have to be very efficient in how you're approaching it. So at Genuitec, we are spread over 9 countries. Most of us are just working, all of us work from our house. When the founders kicked off Genuitec, they had all come from various backgrounds, from banking, from technology, and they said, hey, we want to build a company that's a bit different. They didn't want to commute. They wanted to be able to work from their houses. And that principle of trying to have a balance, now you say, okay, yeah, that's the selfish side, I don't want to commute. But the reasons for that ended up being the key driver to what makes Genuitec successful. So in the background, you'll see some photos of some of the people who actually work at Genuitec. We asked them to submit in their photos. And being virtual really gets told by these stories to me personally, in that there's more to life than the computer. Now, I love computers. I love coding. I've coded from a young age. It's awesome. But, you know, I happen to have a daughter. I have a 7-year-old daughter now. When I was at Cisco, and you can probably do math for timing, she was in daycare from 6:30 in the morning till 6 at night. My wife and I were both working, and said, this isn't our life. As an engineer, I love the code, but I need more than that. And so what happened when I went over to Genuitec is I was able to find that balance. Now for me, that meant I could take the afternoon and pick her up from school, take her to the park, go for a walk with our dog. Silly things like that where I broke up the workday. It's not about necessarily working less. I ended up actually probably working more since I could come back in the evening, work with clients in different time zones, whatever it may be. It provided an opportunity for very efficient work. This last photo, yeah, I know, some guys actually were very honest in how they work, right? Which is great, the fact that it's okay to share. And I'll get to that in a moment when it comes to the sharing side of things, because it really does come down to how do you, when you're working virtually, break down the barriers of a team. Now, being virtually is not something that is you are it or not it. All of us are virtual. So last night over dinner, I was talking with some IBM folks, and they have 430,000 people. So you say, well, yeah, you're always working with a guy sitting next to you. That's not always the case, right? You often have teams where you're working with a few people from other locations. You may be just a one-off guy in your site. When I was at Cisco working with San Jose from Boston or vice versa, you may have somebody in the floor below. You're just moving between projects. You can't always relocate to work with the people you are actually, to sit with the people you are actually working with. And as you kind of take that circle of virtualness, if you will, and you go through these transitions from, okay, yeah, so there's distance now. I'm working from home. I have flexibility. I have flex time. And really, when it comes full circle, you end up with how do you actually have a team virtually? And that's really what I want to talk about today is, what does it take to make a team? Now, it's interesting going on the second day because there's different things we've heard, and some things we've learned. I'm a manager, so bad. We know that. We know that tools are problematic, which actually I agree with, though my take on it may be slightly different, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But what it comes down to is all of these learnings, whether you're GitHub coming up with the policies of no managers, whether you're GDS saying we won't have any rock stars, those are all practices. You've defined an established paradigm by which you're going to work. And when you approach virtual work, that's even more important. Kind of the implicit guidelines you may work by on your sort of daily office. Hey, I bump into somebody at the water cooler and I kind of understand what's going on because I kind of walk around. Doesn't happen when you're virtual. You have to be very explicit in defining how you're going to work. Now, there's all sorts of flavors to that. Some of it is, are you going to have, can I have a manager? Will I not have a manager? Will it be, when are you going to be available? Now, a silly anecdote, and forgive me, after last night, one of our guys was perceived as unresponsive. Now, why did that happen? Very early on in Genuitec, for my own team, I didn't establish any guidelines for what it meant to be available. So, if I sent a message and I didn't hear anything back for 5 minutes, well, clearly he's not working, he's not at his desk. And I started to pick up on other people had this perception that he wasn't a good guy, he wasn't helping, he wasn't chipping in. And it all came down to the fact that the perception was he wasn't available. But how did they get that perception? Well, first off, they had an expectation that as being virtual, that meant you were always at your computer. Well, okay, in our team, we're kind of a dynamic team. I prefer the kind of war room, not war rooms, that sounds very intense, but we like to work together. We're a collaborative team. But I never set any guidelines. I didn't say, hey, guys, when we're working virtually, we need to be clear with our peers, with ourselves, what we're doing. So if I'm going to go take the dog for a walk or have irritable bowel or God knows what it is, that put up a be right back message on Skype. Now, that's a very basic, simple example of, say, putting status on Skype. But it can be profoundly important to understanding how you are working as a team and begin to break down the barriers of how you work. Now, inside Genuitec, we have different team styles. We have styles where each engineer goes off and works on their own. And as I mentioned, my team, I like to work collaboratively. Now, how do you break down the walls of the team you're working with? For my team, that is, we'll sometimes have rolling calls. Now, if you've ever been on a 9-hour Skype call, you're like, oh my gosh, why would I want to have my webcam on for 9 hours? Why would I want to have audio on? What are you going to say for 9 hours, or whatever happened to be the workday that day? Turns out that's never forced. We never actually say, hey, let's just start a long call. There's just days where you're having those kind of design sessions, those whiteboards you might have done when you're in a physical office, and that collaboration happens naturally during the day. It's not something that you can force and say, okay, we're going to be a good team now for the next hour, and we're going to break down the barriers of working virtually. It's something that has to happen organically. And so for my team, it ended up being very effective breaking down the barriers by having that call going. So if somebody happens to go, walk the dog, needs to pick up a kid, some of those things start to come out that may naturally happen in an office environment that you wouldn't normally get virtually. Each team, when you're trying to figure out how to work together, it really comes down to all of you to find your roles. It's not about the manager saying this is the way to do it. It's about what works for you guys, what do you want to know, and kind of feeling the vibe of the team. When I was hearing the different talks, it was very interesting, the kind of the rules of the road of each company. And so, whether technology is evil or good, or humans are good, or is it the 20% time, or is it all of those things are trying to establish ways to find a balance. And that's really what it comes down to, right? I personally don't believe any of us know the way to do things. What I will say, and what I'm here to talk about, is the fact that it's up to all of you to own being virtual and figure out how to be effective in that. Ultimately, whatever team you have, whether you're a 1900 baseball team or God knows what you may be, is optimizing your team. So looking at the strengths you have as an organization. Now, if you're doing, leading software development and you're coding new stuff and you're working together, you're going to need one sort of team dynamic. You're going to be able to be more accessible. You're going to have people kind of throwing code back and forth. And so time zones may become very important, whereby having a dev team in one time zone allows those guys to all really focus in and work well together. But then maybe you throw it over the wall and you have an overseas team finish off quality assurance in the evening. Figuring out how to juggle the assets of your organization to optimize for efficiency. So and I apologize, I feel like I'm speaking manager babble now, but it really is kind of a key capability that we've kind of figured out in Genuitec in really making sure we capitalize on what we have. So, at one point we had kind of the best engineers on whatever the project was, and we really focused on, regardless of where they were located, that they should be part of a project. Say, oh, we're going to do kind of some J2E web stuff, we're going to need some PHP guys, we're going to need some CSS, and let's just grab like the best CSS and the best PHP guys, and we'll put them together, and it's going to be success. Yeah, but it turned out one was in India, one was in the UK, we had another guy in Mexico, a guy in the States, and all of a sudden they can't communicate. And like, yeah, all right, that wasn't a very smart idea. Okay, naughty us. Let's take just really good people. They don't have to be rock stars, but if they're able to work together, they work great. And virtually, you can't ignore some of the things you may sometimes have kind of disappear in a large organization, where when I was at Cisco, we had a lot of the 9-to-5ers. And it would be quite frustrating because they wouldn't be very motivated to do things. And now, obviously, lots of good people at Cisco. I don't mean to say anything bad about them, of course. But in the virtual organization, that can't happen. You know, there's no one to walk by your cube and say, hey, are you working hard? You know, are you doing what you're doing? You can't even get a vibe because no one can really walk by. And that's the other side of it, is communication. So as you set up your team and you're optimizing your team dynamic, is figuring out how are you going to communicate. And like all of us, you know, you don't want to be micromanaged, and it's very hard to do that virtually, right? So you need people who are responsible. I almost made that sound like I wanted to micromanage. It really comes down to figuring out what each person needs. How does the team work together, right? And so when we look at virtualness, it's about that balance, that happiness, the setting of expectations on how people can work. Now, back to where Genuitec started. Genuitec started as a virtual organization. It started with the founders looking for the right people to join the company who would be able to bring the right skills. Turns out at the time it was actually a financial decision. They say, hey, we can get these awesome guys, they can come join us. We could relocate them, or we could pay them really well for where they are, and they can be happier where they are because that's where they wanted to live. And it ended up starting organically, ended up being an opportunistic virtualness. And we've continued to grow like that. So we can actually hire people where they want to be. We had a guy who works for me wanted to go to Italy for a year. And so he was from Minnesota, he went to Italy for a year. Now that's awesome. Yeah, okay, we had to kind of shuffle a little bit where he worked for time zone reasons and things. But it was a great opportunity for him to be able to kind of explore life. Now, kind of ending up on a technical theme here, technology is great. Technology is awesome. It's not perfect. Now, this whole, you know, throwing all the technology away, I take a slightly different slant at it. Don't sweat the small stuff. It's silly cliche, but you know, the reason we have both GoToMeeting and WebEx in there is I'm sure some of you know GoToMeeting doesn't share from Linux, and it turns out WebEx crashes if you use a USB device on Mac. So, lovely, and we had developers on all three. Technology isn't going to be perfect, and we could have spent all day trying to find something else. We ended up just having 2 accounts, and sometimes we'll just have both open. It's very silly, very lightweight. And you can get really caught up in trying to find the right tool, the right way to do things. Instead, you got to focus on just getting work done. Doesn't matter if you use 2 tools. Who cares? It's another 20 bucks a month. I mean, in the end of the day, it doesn't make a difference. In our own case, we were doing software delivery. And just like the brew pie guy, Elko, there isn't always the right technology. So in our case, we happen to say, hey, we do software delivery. There's not a good way for us to deliver our product. Various release channels happen to be a client-based solution. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of desktops to deliver to. We ended up needing to produce a technology that would help do that. So when it comes right down to it, to be virtual, technology is a key foundation to being effective. Try to find things that are close if you can. Don't build. It's not worth building if you don't need to just to work. If it turns out it's actually holding you back and is breaking down, you know, stopping productivity, obviously is key. But really the key message, you know, my takeaway when I was asked to speak about being, how we're as a virtual company, is it's finding that balance, figuring out how to make your team effective, obviously drinking lots of beer, and well done for an awesome show, and making sure people are happy. Yes, technology matters. Yes, what you're developing matters. But really, guys, go out there, be virtual, be awesome, and thank you.
Nice. Thank you. That was great.